So for the second Art Matters Art History shorts, I wanted to talk about Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a Roman painter working in the early Baroque period at the beginning of the 17th century. She had a very successful career, gaining patrons such as Charles I and the Medici family. And I think she's particularly impressive as she carved out such a successful career in such a deeply patriarchal society. And in doing so, she offered refreshing depictions of women that were very controversial for the time, and I think that makes her a very interesting person to look at. Gentileschi's father, Orazio Gentileschi, was also an artist, and so she grew up in a very artistic environment and was able to engage with it on a regular basis, which not many women at her time would have been able to do. Um, as well, that meant that she could hone her artistic craft from a very young age, and she was only 17 when she made this piece, Susanna and the Elders, which depicts a biblical episode from the Apocrypha, where a young woman, Susanna, is bathing in her garden when two men threaten her with sexual violence and tell her they will accuse her of adultery if she does not submit to them. And Gentileschi's depiction really focuses on the physical rejection of Susanna. Her body is twisted away from them, her arms are outstretched in an attempt to ward off their invasion. Her sorrow brow depicts the turmoil she is in and the distressing nature of this encounter. And interestingly, Gentileschi establishes this sort of vertical relationship with her subjects as a means to exemplify the power dynamic. The men are, in an attempt to invade her space, lean over this panel that separates them from Susanna. They almost snatch at her hair, and the men tower above her, exerting their dominance. And their sort of heavily cloaked bodies serve to emphasize Susanna's nudity and therefore her vulnerability. As a viewer, I feel her discomfort and sort of insecurity and exposure. And it really focuses on her discomfort and suffering that Susanna endures. And Gentileschi really tells the story of this invasion from a woman's perspective rather than a man's. This piece has been depicted by other artists at the time, male artists at the time, and their pieces, I think, really sort of serve to emphasize Susanna's nudity and her form and focus on the sort of sexualization of her, and sort of depict her more as a sort of temptress or femme fatale figure that lure the men into sort of this sort of preying upon her. The blame is really laid upon Susanna, whereas I think Gentileschi does the opposite. In 1611, while she was still 17, she was working in her father's studio, and she was raped by her father's contemporary, Agostino Tassi. And they engaged in a sexual relationship for around 6 months, and then in 1612, Orazio discovered that Tassi had raped his daughter and that Tassi refused to marry her. So he took him to a trial on the basis of ruining the family's reputation. During the trial, Artemisia agreed to judicial torture, an attempt to sort of prove she was telling the truth, as she knew that being a woman meant that her story wasn't going to be believed over a man's. So the method of torture was that the ropes were tied to her fingers and they were pulled, effectively breaking her fingers. Pretty detrimental injury for an artist. So there was a long period of time where she was unable to artistically express her emotions. And once the trial concluded, Tassi was found guilty, but his punishment was never enforced. Following the trial and her recovery from her injuries, Gentileschi paints Judith slaying Holofernes, which again is a biblical depiction and tells the story of Judith, who saved her people by seducing and beheading the Assyrian general Holofernes. It was a very common theme for the 17th century and 16th century, and the same scene has been painted by artists such as Botticelli, Donatello, and Andrea Mantegna. This sort of extremely violent depiction shows the blood spurting onto the bed sheets, dripping down the mattress, and sort of splattering onto Judith's neck and chest and torso. This sort of unflinching recount would have been very shocking to contemporaries at the time due to the extreme violence depicted, and not only the extreme violence, but the fact that a woman was depicting it was very controversial. The woman's strength, I think, is shown in their design. Judith's strong arms that are locked in the position that they're in. Her hand is gripping his hair. She uses his own sword to sort of pierce his neck, as well as the fact that the maid is sort of helping her. And despite Holofernes' attempt to sort of push the maid away, they remain determined in his killing. Both of the women are depicted with like these furrowed brows, which further shows their sort of concentration and determination. That neither of them show any signs of hesitation. They're both sort of united in this common goal of killing Holofernes. Gentileschi also depicts the maid with Judith, which is unusual in terms of the story. The biblical story tells that the maid is actually outside of the room whilst Judith is slaying Holofernes. But Gentileschi depicts the women together, possibly as a symbol of sort of female unification against sort of male oppression, possibly. And again, this sort of vertical relationship between the subjects is established as a means to sort of show the power dynamic between them. Now the women are above the men, sort of an inverse of Susanna and the elders. This piece, when seen in real life, is placed upon a wall where Holofernes' face is sort of eye line with us. So the female forms are elevated above our eye line, and sort of they are life size as well. So there's definitely the sense of the women are in power here and they are dominating this scene. I think it's very interesting to sort of see the difference in the way in which Gentileschi depicts female and male sort of power dynamics after such a traumatic event in her life, and sort of showing the implications of an artist's sort of context in their life and how it influences their own depictions. I also just think the painting itself is very technically accomplished. The detail shown in the sort of the faces and the drapery is really impressive, and the realism of the blood spurting out and dripping down the mattress, as well as the sort of intricate details of Judith's hair and her clothing. So this is Caravaggio's depiction of the same scene, painted around 13-14 years before Gentileschi's. As I think it's very interesting to sort of look at the depiction of Judith specifically, as I think it's quite different. Here she's sort of drawn back a bit. She's almost disgusted by what she's doing. She's using her arms as a means of sort of separation and distance from this act, whereas in Gentileschi's, I think Judith was using her arms as a means of wielding power and sort of suppressing Holofernes' fighting back. Judith's sort of unsurety here, I think, is interesting from looking at a male perspective when depicting women in sort of more powerful roles. I personally think that maybe Caravaggio doesn't really understand the sort of the anger and the sort of female rage that can come along with sort of when killing someone. I think his portrayal of Judith is possibly a little unrealistic, as when killing someone in the way in which Judith is, I think determination and sort of lack of hesitance is important. And that may be due to the fact that as a man he might not understand the sort of, like I said, female rage, and possibly sort of underestimates the strength and ability that a woman can wield in when she needs to kill someone. Much like Gentileschi's, Caravaggio's chiaroscuro is used as a means to really highlight the figures, and I think his drapery is very impressive, and the realism is of a high degree. I just think that the blood spurting from Holofernes' neck is possibly less realistic when comparing it to Gentileschi's. I think it's very interesting to see how such a traumatic experience in Gentileschi's life left an enduring impact on the way in which she depicted power dynamics between men and women. And I've only shown her earlier pieces, but it's a reoccurring theme throughout her life, and she did continue to paint until her death when she was around 60 years old. I think her story is very fascinating, and the pieces that she made, I think, are interesting to compare to her male counterparts who depict similar scenes, and to sort of see the different perspective that a woman can bring when painting in similar scenes. Artemisia is now known as the sort of first artist feminist, and paved the way for the future of female artists, which I find inspiring.